Hey everyone. Tonight, we're plunging straight into a world where beauty wasn't merely painful, it was genuinely terrifying. Imagine the Middle Ages, where being considered attractive often meant looking halfway dead. Picture skin as pale as a ghost, cheeks hollowed out, and eyes so darkly shadowed they could pass for bruises. Realistically, you probably wouldn't survive this beauty routine. But relax, for now, it's just a bedtime story. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I make here. Tell me what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. You're sitting in a cold stone room lit by trembling candlelight. The air carries the scent of beeswax and old wool. In front of you stands a warped bronze mirror, and you're trying to perfect your appearance. But in the 14th century, what exactly counts as perfect? To begin with, if your skin has even the slightest trace of color, you're already losing. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was essential. It signaled wealth. A tan meant you labored outside like a peasant, and that, to the upper classes, was unacceptable. But simple paleness wasn't enough. The ideal was translucent skin, with faint blue veins visible across the forehead and chest. That unhealthy, almost corpse-like look was considered peak beauty. So how did people chase that effect? Mostly through a dreadful mix of bloodletting and staying indoors like a medieval vampire. Women might smear on thick mixtures made from vinegar, crushed pearls, and lead to whiten the complexion. Yes, actual lead. It irritated the skin, eroded it over time, and slowly poisoned the body. But apparently, if you looked aristocratic while doing it, that made it worthwhile. One historical figure often mentioned in this context is Elizabeth of York. In portraits, she appears with an astonishingly pale face, hollow cheeks, and dark, deep-set eyes framed beneath a high forehead. All of that fit the beauty standard of the time. Historians still argue over whether those portraits reflected reality or idealized fantasy. Maybe she really looked that way. Maybe artists exaggerated. But one thing is clear. Looking like elegant death was absolutely part of the aesthetic, and women leaned into it hard. And then there were the cheeks. If you wanted that fashionable, sunken look, there was no contour palette waiting for you. Instead, there was self-denial. Wealthy women were known to restrict what they ate, not only to remain thin, but also to keep the face slightly hollow and ethereal. Some even sucked on lemons or rubbed lemon juice across the skin, hoping the acidity would somehow reduce fullness in the cheeks. It sounds invented, but it wasn't. Tips like this were genuinely passed from woman to woman. Of course, painters played their part too. Medieval artists weren't aiming for realism. The women they painted were filtered through religion, class fantasies, and social expectation. Smooth, deathly skin wasn't merely beautiful. It was virtuous, even holy. A pure soul was supposed to dwell in a pure body. That meant no blemishes, no warmth, no color. If you were lucky, an artist might add some gold leaf around your halo. If not, you still ended up looking like a very fashionable ghost. Here's the strange part. While noble women were desperately trying to appear pale and frail, peasant women were, well, visibly alive. They had skin darkened by the sun, strong arms from hauling water, and flushed cheeks from actual labor and oxygen. To the elite, this was horrifying. To us, honestly, it sounds refreshing. But the distinction mattered. If a noble woman spent too much time in the sun and her skin darkened, it could become a real scandal. She might lose status, or worse, people might start associating that change with moral decline. Beauty and virtue were tangled together so tightly that your face was treated like a public declaration of your worth. There was even a particularly odd trend, especially in parts of northern Italy, involving leeches. They were used for both medical and cosmetic purposes. Want to clear a blemish? Hoping to lighten your complexion? Put leeches on your face and let them feed. People genuinely believed that drawing out blood would remove impurities. Scientific? Not remotely. Painful? Without question. Effective? Very debatable. Historians still argue over how literal these standards really were. Some claim the deathly pale beauty ideal existed more in literature and art than in everyday life, something aspirational rather than fully practiced. Others believe upper-class women, especially those in courtly settings, took these standards extremely seriously and altered their routines and bodies to meet them. Which interpretation is right? It's hard to know. Personal diaries from that period are rare, and beauty was not something people tended to discuss openly. It was simply assumed, expected, absorbed into daily life. And that's the real cruelty of it. The horror wasn't only in the lead-based creams or the starvation habits. It was in the silence. There was no love yourself movement, no permission to opt out. If you failed to conform, you weren't simply unfashionable. You were suspicious, perhaps sinful, perhaps ill, maybe both. So there you are, staring into that blurred bronze mirror. Your skin burns from the vinegar. Your cheeks ache from fasting. Candlelight flickers across your face and catches another brutal requirement. Your eyebrows. They had to go too. Women plucked them until only the faintest shadow remained. Not because expression was disliked exactly, but because brows were seen as distracting, even crude. A woman's face was supposed to appear smooth and restrained, like a saint's relic or a carved statue. Emotion was disorderly. Emotion made you human. And being visibly human was not exactly the goal. Some women went even further than removing brows. They darkened the scalp or the narrow fringe near the forehead, so the surrounding skin would appear even paler by contrast. Imagine dusting the area above the brows with white chalk or powdered bone, so the face seemed to glow with an eerie brightness. It wasn't natural. It wasn't flattering in any modern sense. But it was expected. Naturally, none of this was comfortable. Infections were common. The tools were rough, hygiene was unreliable, and one careless movement could leave the skin raw or bleeding. And you couldn't exactly stop. Let your hairline creep forward a bit, and people started whispering. Was she lazy? Had she lost her virtue? Was she slipping in status? Was she poor? Not everyone embraced this madness, of course. In rural parts of Europe, many women had more urgent problems than cosmetic plucking, like surviving winter or childbirth. But among noble women in courts from Paris to London, the standard held real power. Beauty was not merely visual. It was a social contract. Break it, and you risked your reputation, your marriage prospects, and sometimes even your inheritance. Historians still debate how widespread this obsession with the forehead really was. Some say it remained mostly within fashion-conscious courts. Others think it trickled downward into the households of the rising middle class, where women copied elite beauty practices out of aspiration, anxiety, or both. The truth, as usual, probably sits somewhere in the middle. But there's no denying that the high forehead became a cultural shorthand for grace, femininity, and aristocratic refinement. It's unsettling, really. In a world where women had very little control over their lives, appearance became one of the few visible things they could shape. But even that choice was a trap. You weren't deciding how to look. You were deciding how to suffer. So you lean closer to the candlelit mirror, skin tingling from the vinegar, scalp irritated from plucking. Your hairline has been pushed high enough to pass inspection. Your brows are barely there. You look calm, unreadable, composed, and honestly, slightly haunted. Your skin is pale enough now. Congratulations. You resemble a ghost lifted from a manuscript illustration. But the next challenge is even stranger. Your forehead. Yes, your forehead. Because in the Middle Ages, the higher it was, the more beautiful you were considered. And if modern contour routines seem excessive, brace yourself. Medieval women literally plucked back the hairline, one strand at a time. No, this is not a joke. The ideal woman was supposed to have a forehead so high it seemed to stretch halfway up the skull. That was taken as a sign of intelligence, nobility, and spiritual purity. To create that effect, women plucked, shaved, or even rubbed the skin with walnut oil or vinegar-soaked bandages to weaken the hair and make it fall out. Eyebrows vanished. Baby hairs disappeared. In some cases, women shaved the top of the head back by an inch or more, just to exaggerate the shape. Think of it as the medieval predecessor to the five-head, except it was aspirational. Historians still debate where this obsession came from. Was it purely aesthetic? Was it rooted in religious imagery? A lot of depictions of the Virgin Mary feature a high, smooth forehead, which makes sense in a culture where the church controlled so much of visual life. Women were expected to model themselves after the divine. A calm brow, free of expressive tension, was read as evidence of self-control. You weren't supposed to look emotional. You were supposed to look serene. Imagine the daily maintenance. You sit near the hearth in weak morning light, tweezers in hand, yanking out hair and trying not to cry. Because crying makes the skin swell, and then you have another problem to solve. Maybe you crush rose petals to cool the under-eye area. Beauty, in this world, is not an occasional ritual. It's a full-time occupation. There's a dramatic story associated with Isabeau of Bavaria. According to some accounts, admittedly possibly embellished, she plucked her hairline so aggressively that she permanently damaged the follicles. For years afterward, she supposedly relied on elaborate headdresses to hide the patchiness. Those headpieces became so large and heavy that they caused neck pain. And since chiropractors were not exactly a medieval option, the only available remedy was basically prayer. Of course, the high forehead did not stand alone. It was framed by veils, wimples, hennons, and snoods, all carefully arranged to emphasize the brow. The hennon, that famous cone-shaped hat people love to associate with fairy tale princesses, was often tilted back to put the forehead front and center. Extra points if the skin looked thin enough for veins to show. Visible veins suggested delicacy, fragility, a parchment-like fineness that people apparently found irresistible. What's both funny and terrible is that even if your actual forehead didn't fit the ideal, you still had to pretend it did. Portrait painters frequently elongated faces and exaggerated brows, whether the sitter naturally looked that way or not. Some modern historians think many of those proportions in medieval portraiture weren't real at all. They were edited, the medieval version of filters and face tuning. The more things change, the more they really don't. And then there was the mouth, because while the face was meant to be admired, the mouth had to behave itself. In some medieval courts, there was an unwritten rule about how much of it a woman could reveal. A smile was acceptable, but only just. A faint, restrained one. Mona Lisa-level restraint. No open laughter, no broad grins. Showing too much of the teeth was dangerous for your image. Joy itself wasn't seen as particularly feminine. You were supposed to appear distant, ethereal, maybe a little melancholy, as though you were waiting either for your husband to return from war or for heaven to claim you. Anything more animated risked looking improper. Some historians even float a debated theory that upper-class girls were informally trained to suppress laughter. The logic was that smiling too broadly distorted the face, exposed the teeth, deepened lines, and ruined the powdered calm expected of elite beauty. Whether this was officially taught or simply enforced by social pressure, we can't know for sure. But facial restraint was absolutely real. Beauty wasn't only about appearance, it was about stillness. Now imagine being a teenager in that world. Your peers are all trying to make their mouths look smaller and their teeth less noticeable. There are no braces, no whitening strips, no modern dentistry, just herbs, powders, and prayer. If your teeth were crooked or large, too bad. You could become a subject of ridicule, avoidance, or quiet pity. In some cases, wealthier families even had visible teeth removed in hopes of making a daughter's mouth appear smaller and more delicate. The pain and infection risk were apparently considered acceptable trade-offs if it improved marriage prospects. It wasn't completely hopeless. A few rare medieval beauty manuals, tucked away in monastic collections, offered gentler methods for cleaning the mouth. One manuscript suggests rubbing sage leaves across the teeth and drinking wine infused with mint. Honestly, compared to everything else, that almost sounds sensible. But what lingers is the quiet cruelty behind it all. You were expected to silence the body to be seen as good. Your mouth, your appetite, your voice, all of it had to be reduced. The smaller and more controlled you seemed, the more ideal you became. So here you are again, back in your chamber. You haven't smiled properly in hours. Between meals, you chew fennel seeds. You scrape at your teeth with crushed eggshells. You keep yourself from laughing even when something is funny. Because beauty, in this era, has nothing to do with joy. It is discipline. And if your teeth are starting to hurt, don't worry. That only means it's working. Your forehead is now the envy of noble women from London to Lubeck. You've sacrificed your brows, your scalp, and probably a piece of your sanity. But at last you're approaching the perfect medieval look. A pale, expressionless surface ready to be admired, judged, and quietly monitored. But don't get comfortable yet. Now we move deeper into the madness. We're talking about teeth. Not just any teeth either. Tiny, discreet, impossibly delicate teeth. The kind that are never fully shown, never revealed in a wide grin, and certainly never allowed to suggest that you've ever bitten into anything firmer than a grape. In medieval beauty culture, the mouth was a contradiction. It had to exist, obviously, but it was not supposed to do very much. No loud laughing, no broad smiles, no shouting across the courtyard because someone's goat got loose again. Lips were meant to stay closed, soft, demure, and mysterious. Teeth were only acceptable if they were small, pale, even, and mostly hidden. If people could clearly see your teeth, you were already doing femininity wrong. And this wasn't just a matter of taste. It carried moral weight. A small, closed mouth signaled modesty and self-control. A wide mouth, or large visible teeth, hinted at gluttony, vulgarity, and in some cases even sexual looseness. Women with larger mouths might be described as loud, opinionated, or, worst of all, unladylike. The ideal was to seem almost insubstantial, like a gentle breeze of a person with delicate features and absolutely no disruptive opinions. There's a remarkable line in a 14th century French romance in which a hero praises a woman by saying her teeth are so fine and so small they wouldn't break the skin of a grape. Very romantic, unless the meal involves anything harder than fruit. In practical terms, those ornamental little teeth don't exactly inspire confidence at dinner. Of course, the reality of oral care in the Middle Ages was another nightmare entirely. No one had toothpaste in the modern sense. People used herbs, salt, vinegar, and even burned rosemary ash to scrub the teeth, assuming they bothered at all. Among commoners, oral hygiene varied wildly. Among the elite, it was somewhat more common, but the focus leaned heavily toward appearance rather than health. So while a woman might rub her gums raw trying to whiten her smile, preventing actual tooth decay was not necessarily the goal. That led to one of the era's more bitter ironies. The women most determined to preserve their teeth often damaged them the most. There are records of women using abrasives like ground coral and brick dust to polish the enamel. Brick dust. It might make the teeth appear cleaner for a while, but eventually the enamel wore away and the teeth began to crumble. The ideal became darkly absurd. Tiny white teeth polished into destruction, then admired as signs of refinement. At least, as ever, you looked pious while it happened. And then there was breath. Because it's no use hiding your tiny, elegant teeth behind a perfect little smile if the air around you smells like boiled eel and despair. So women chewed herbs, parsley, mint, cloves, fennel. Some rinsed the mouth with rose water. In parts of Italy, women were known to chew fennel seeds and sometimes sprinkle cinnamon into the mouth before attending social gatherings. It wasn't truly dental care, but it helped maintain the illusion. So now you are pale, hollow-cheeked, carefully depilated in all the wrong places, and your mouth is small enough to pass medieval inspection. Surely that should be enough. Except it isn't, because now comes the final thread tying the whole look together. Thinness. Not simply being slim, but appearing fragile, almost weightless, as though one missed meal away from sainthood. In the Middle Ages, looking as though you hadn't eaten properly in days was not merely fashionable. It could be interpreted as holy. Fasting was not reserved for monks and mystics. Among noble women, refusing food became both a spiritual performance and a sign of status. The thinner a woman was, the more disciplined and virtuous she was assumed to be. A fuller body might suggest health, yes, but it also invited suspicion, indulgence, excess, moral softness. The ideal body was delicate and slight, a shape that seemed soft enough to be feminine, yet fragile enough to suggest constant restraint. And this was not always a private behavior. In many aristocratic settings, fasting became visibly performative. Women attended feasts, then barely touched what was served. They might sip watered wine or pick at a piece of bread with almost theatrical care. It wasn't about nutrition. It was about the message. I deny myself. I control myself. I am holier than appetite. A striking example is Catherine of Siena. She is one of the most famous medieval figures associated with extreme fasting. Catherine claimed to survive for years on almost nothing but the Eucharist. In other words, the communion wafer. Many modern historians suspect she may have suffered from what we would now identify as an eating disorder, though of course no one described it in those terms at the time. Instead, her self-starvation was interpreted as extraordinary devotion. She was canonized, and her gaunt, hollowed image became part of the beauty and piety ideal for generations. And that's where things turn darker still. Spiritual purity and physical appearance were not merely linked. They were often treated as the same thing. A naturally pale, thin woman might be seen as blessed, almost saint-like. A woman who achieved that look through fasting, vomiting-inducing herbs, or self-punishment could be admired too, but in a different register. Not for ease, but for suffering. There's even that unsettling idea sometimes called holy anorexia. Not a medieval medical term, of course, but a modern label for women whose starvation was framed as spiritual triumph. Some women fasted until they hallucinated, until ecstasy and collapse blurred together. Noble families occasionally encouraged this behavior in daughters, seeing it as a route toward sainthood, or at least toward prestige. Imagine that, a family's religious reputation enhanced by a girl disappearing before their eyes. Men fasted too, especially in monasteries, but for women the meaning shifted. It became intensely gendered. Fasting was not only about rejecting the body's desires, it was about proving you were too pure for the body's ordinary needs, too sacred for hunger, too refined for appetite. Your body became less a home and more a shrine. Now imagine the daily reality. You wake in a freezing stone room, despite the fire that barely warms anything. A maid brings your breakfast. a hard crust of rye bread, perhaps a cup of goat's milk. You wave it away. You're fasting, though everyone understands that this is also about image. Your head aches, your limbs feel weak, but you compose your face and move quietly through the day. If you faint during morning prayers, the room pretends not to notice. Around you, among the noble women, there is an unspoken competition. Who can go longest without eating? Who can survive on broth, herbs, and little else? Who can look faint and radiant at the same time? It is harsh, lonely, and strangely admired. Even fashion reinforced the expectation. Gowns were fitted around the ribs and torso to highlight a narrow middle. The garments were not yet full Renaissance corsets, but they were moving in that direction. Some were so stiff and unforgiving, they left no room for a generous meal or even a full, deep breath. The silhouette people admired was long, slim, reed-like. Hips and breasts could exist, yes, but the stomach had to stay flat, the body controlled. You were meant to look as though you could survive on air, prayer, and social approval. Scholars still argue over how many women actually lived by these standards, and how many simply lived under images produced by male writers, artists, and clerics. That's an important question. Much of what survives comes from men describing women, poets idealizing them, churchmen praising sacrifice, painters smoothing and refining bodies into symbols. Still, fragments of physical evidence, clothing, letters, and manuscripts suggest that many women really did shape their lives around these pressures. Class, of course, mattered enormously. Peasant women could not afford to fast in this way, nor were they expected to. They needed strength to work, carry, survive, and give birth. But the higher one climbed socially, the emptier the plate was supposed to remain. The rich had access to abundant food and were praised for behaving as though they did not want it. And there are even more disturbing details. Some women reportedly chewed food and then discreetly spat it into cloths or napkins so they could enjoy the ritual of eating without swallowing. A courtly, socially acceptable version of disordered behavior, centuries before the language existed to name it. So here you are again, seated in a hall lit by candles. Your lord tears into roast pheasant while the rich smell makes your stomach clench. You sip diluted wine and pretend indifference. Your gown digs into your ribs. You haven't eaten properly in days, but everyone praises your lightness and grace. You feel dizzy. Someone leans close and whispers, "You look radiant tonight." You smile faintly. You are starving. And that is precisely the point. You've stopped eating. You've erased your eyebrows. You've trained your mouth into a controlled, delicate line. But even now, the work is not finished. Because beyond paleness and thinness lies the most impossible layer of all: purity. Not just cleanliness of appearance, but that larger, heavier, more dangerous concept: virginity. And not even real, lived virginity, but an idealized fantasy made from religious doctrine, courtly poetry, and collective delusion. This was the virgin ideal. In the Middle Ages, a beautiful woman was not simply someone who looked pleasing. She had to appear as though she had never even conceived of sex. If she was married, somehow she was still expected to preserve the atmosphere of untouched innocence. The ideal was absurd. You had to be graceful but unreadable, desirable but not sensual, visible but morally transparent. In other words, a contradiction in expensive fabric. The obvious root of all this was religion. The Virgin Mary stood at the center of the model. She was held up as the ultimate woman, kind, obedient, gentle, self-sacrificing, and eternally untouched. Poets and painters built an entire system of femininity around her. Real women, complicated, living, imperfect women, were expected to bend themselves into that shape. Pale, passive, pure. Imagine yourself at 13 or 14, just old enough for marriage arrangements to begin. Your mother has already instructed you to walk modestly, avoid unnecessary eye contact with men, and never raise your voice unless directly addressed. You have been taught how to sit correctly, how to lower your gaze, how to say no in a way that still sounds soft and innocent. You've also learned that visible curiosity can be dangerous. Passion in any form might be mistaken for moral looseness. Even your clothes participate in the performance. Your gown might be cut modestly, but made from costly fabric that signals your family's position. Your hair may be veiled not only for decorum, but because uncovered female hair was associated with temptation. The more covered you looked, the safer, and supposedly better, you seemed. In some places, modesty was not merely encouraged, but enforced by law. In parts of medieval Italy, rules dictated how much of the body unmarried women were allowed to show. There really were social mechanisms dedicated to policing female purity. There's also the story of Agnes of Rome, a very young girl canonized for refusing marriage and protecting her chastity unto death. Her legend was repeated as a moral lesson for girls, an example of sacred innocence. In art, she appears with a lamb, the symbol of purity, and with a face so calm and blank, she seems almost sedated. That was, apparently, the desired mood: passive, pure, silent. And the body itself was expected to reflect this purity. A delicate nose, large eyes, but not so lively that they suggested curiosity. A smooth, high forehead naturally, because nothing said innocence quite like an enormous blank expanse above the brows. Medieval descriptions of beauty are full of milk-white skin, hair like spun gold, and voices soft enough not to disturb a bird. Poetic, yes, but in practice, it meant that girls were expected to take up as little emotional and sensory space as possible. Hair carried enormous symbolic weight too. Loose hair on a woman could signal seduction, danger, or lack of control. That's why brides wore their hair down on the wedding day, to symbolize virginity and transition. After marriage, it was covered or tightly arranged. Loose hair outside that context could read as a warning sign. The rules were not always written down, but they were understood. And the stakes for failing them were high. A woman suspected of impurity could be humiliated, disinherited, cast out, even killed. It might begin with almost nothing: a rumor, an accusation, a badly timed private conversation in a garden. Noble daughters functioned as political assets. If a girl's virginity was doubted, marriage negotiations could collapse, alliances could be damaged, whole families could lose standing. Historians still debate how directly these purity ideals shaped women's everyday lives. Some argue they remained largely literary and symbolic, floating through poems and sermons more than daily behavior. Others point out that women did find ways to work within the system. Some leveraged reputations for virginity as bargaining tools. Some attempted to imitate its signs artificially, with herbs, stories, and social performance. Others withdrew into convents, choosing religious life as an escape from the marriage market altogether. There are even reports that in some places, midwives or healers offered methods to restore virginity through treatments or minor procedures. Essentially, a medieval version of reconstructive deception. Not common, but not unimaginable either. Reputation had material value, and people would go to extraordinary lengths to preserve it. And yet, despite the suffocating standards, women still found ways to live. They laughed, gossiped, flirted, wrote, schemed, and loved. They traded secrets under veils, behind tapestries, in corners of chapels and gardens. They carved out moments of rebellion under heavy cloth and heavier expectations. But they did so knowing that a single misread gesture could become a story, and a story in that world could become a life sentence. So here you sit in a garden under the watchful eye of a chaperone. Your hands are folded, your voice stays low. You are only 13, but you already know the script. You must be beautiful, but never in a way that looks intentional. Innocent, but not foolish. Present, but quiet. Somewhere behind a hedge, another girl laughs too freely with a page boy, and your body tenses. Not from jealousy, from fear. Because you know how quickly a moment like that becomes a rumor, and how quickly rumor hardens into identity. So yes, you have achieved the holy trifecta: pale, quiet, and virginal. But there is still one more thing missing. Your hair. Your literal crown. In the medieval imagination, hair color could shape your whole social aura. And if you were reaching for the highest version of elite beauty, there was one shade above all others. Blonde. Not merely light brown. Not warm honey. Not straw. The ideal was luminous, sunstruck, nearly sacred gold. Hair that seemed to glow under candlelight, like a halo. And if you were not born with it, that was unfortunate. You were expected to improvise, even if the process scorched your scalp. This obsession did not appear out of thin air. In medieval Europe, blonde hair came to symbolize youth, purity, grace, and the divine. Artists painted saints and angels with golden hair, even when depicting women from regions where such coloring was uncommon. Blonde became visual shorthand for heavenly value. It meant innocence, delicacy, and a kind of untouchable brightness. For brunettes and redheads, naturally, this created a problem. So women got creative, or desperate. They soaked hair in caustic mixtures of lye, alum, and stale urine, then sat in the sun for hours, hoping the strands would lighten. Yes, urine again. Sometimes it worked, though worked is generous. What it often produced was dry, brittle hair, the color of old straw. plus burns and irritation across the scalp. One especially infamous recipe from a 15th century Italian beauty manuscript tells women to mix saffron, lemon juice, and goat urine. Apply it to the hair, then sit outdoors wearing a hat with the crown cut out, so only the hair itself baked in the sunlight. The intended result was brighter, fairer hair. The actual result was frequently damage, breakage, and a halo of crisp regret. Wigs were not the easy solution they would later become. They were uncommon, hot, uncomfortable, and often viewed as too theatrical or deceptive. Some women instead used veils dyed in warm golden tones, so that a suggestion of blondness showed through the fabric. But that was only an imitation. What people wanted was the real shimmer, or at least something convincing enough to pass. A useful example here is Lucrezia Borgia. She lived a bit later, edging into the Renaissance, but her golden hair became so admired that locks of it were reportedly sent as diplomatic gifts. Whether that blondness was entirely natural is debated, but the symbolism is clear. Golden hair meant power, allure, and influence. It turned women into icons. And of course, the ideal excluded and distorted entire populations. Dark-haired women, particularly from Southern Europe or the East, could be cast as seductive, exotic, dangerous, morally uncertain. In medieval literature, the dark-haired temptress was often the threat, while the golden-haired maiden was the woman worthy of rescue and marriage. Beauty was never neutral. It carried racialized and cultural meaning too. Courtly love literature only intensified all of this. Poems and songs kept returning to the same image: the perfect lady with golden hair, gentle manners, and a touch of sadness. Men in those stories composed songs for her, suffered nobly for her, died in tournaments for her. So naturally, real women tried to imitate the fiction, even knowing how fictional it was. There is even an account from 14th century England of a noblewoman who allegedly blinded herself while attempting to lighten her hair, after bleach splashed into her eyes during treatment. According to the story, she had been trying to replicate the shade of a woman in a painting. Art inspired life, and life paid the price. Even when the damage was less dramatic, it was still real. Repeated bleaching treatments led to hair loss, scalp sores, infections, and persistent irritation. And the smell. Urine-based recipes in particular left women carrying the unmistakable fragrance of stable-yard chemistry. Imagine entering court looking like an angel and smelling faintly of livestock. But as always, the deeper point wasn't just the hair. It was what the hair represented. You weren't simply bleaching strands. You were trying to bleach yourself into alignment with an ideal, an imagined version of womanhood that was prized, praised, and often impossible. Blonde became a shortcut to grace, romance, divinity. That didn't make it fair. Medieval beauty rarely was. Historians still disagree about how widespread the pressure really was. Some argue that this obsession with blondness stayed mostly among aristocratic women who had the time and resources to pursue it. Others believe it filtered into urban merchant classes, especially in places like Venice and Florence, where display mattered and imitation of elite culture flourished. Men played their part too, flooding the culture with songs and poems praising golden-haired maidens until the image felt inescapable. And so you sit again by the window in your chamber, scalp still stinging. You have followed the beauty recipe whispered from lady to lady. Sunlight falls through the hole in your strange hat. Your hair steams. You smell faintly of citrus and barnyard. A servant fans you half-heartedly. You feel light-headed, though perhaps that is simply the mixture. Later, at court, someone glances toward you. Your hair catches candlelight. It glows. For one small moment, you think perhaps the suffering was worth it. Then another person turns to look, and another. You smile carefully and remind yourself not to scratch, even though your scalp is burning. And by now, surely, the larger truth is becoming impossible to miss. Medieval beauty was not really about appearing fully alive. It was about looking as though you were gently fading. By now, you've probably realized that medieval beauty was less about looking healthy and more about appearing as though you were slowly slipping out of the world. But don't assume that this obsession with delicacy meant people actually smelled delicate. Not even close. Welcome to the rank, perfumed underside of medieval beauty culture, where bathing was inconsistent, sweat was unavoidable, and the nose had to work overtime just to get you through the day with dignity intact. To be fair, medieval people were not completely unfamiliar with washing. They did bathe when circumstances allowed. But among noblewomen, hygiene was often framed less as health and more as image. You were expected to smell fresh, floral, refined, but without too much actual immersion in water. Bathing itself could be viewed with suspicion. Medical thinkers sometimes argued that hot water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease, moral corruption, or both. Apparently, even your bath could be blamed for disaster. So what did women do instead? They perfumed themselves. Heavily. Rose water, lavender oil, violet infusions, spiced vinegar, anything that suggested freshness without requiring what we would now call a proper wash. Some tucked dried herbs into their undergarments: mint, thyme, marjoram, rosemary. In effect, they turned their clothing into wearable sachets. Linen chemises and veils were often laundered more frequently than the skin beneath them. Partly because clean fabric helped preserve the illusion that the entire person must surely be clean as well. And then there were the tools of scented survival. Perfumed gloves, pomanders, tiny metal balls filled with fragrant resins or herbs, small garlands pinned into clothing or worn near the neck. These weren't decorative extras. They were defensive equipment. The upper classes understood very well that the world smelled bad. The real trick was simply to smell better than everyone else nearby. Hair, too, demanded its own disguise. If you thought scalp care was a modern fixation, think again. Medieval women could go quite a while without washing their hair, especially if it was kept braided and covered. Instead of cleansing, they often relied on scented oils to mask buildup. Rosemary oil, clove, bay leaf infusions. Not because these made the hair truly clean, but because they made it smell less alarming. Your head may have been hosting its own ecosystem, but at least it hinted at herbs. One beauty manual from the 14th century recommends boiling rosemary in wine and using the liquid to rinse the hair and cheer the brain. Charming advice, until you remember that lice were a very real and very common problem. Delousing was constant, tedious, and itchy. Women used fine combs, vinegar rinses, and patience. A great deal of patience. Not everyone had the luxury of scented oils and floral distillations. Poorer women, especially in towns, sometimes relied on public bathhouses, at least until those spaces came under moral suspicion. Once church authorities began associating bathhouses with lust, vice, and moral decay, many were shut down or tightly controlled. From then on, washing at home with a basin, a cloth, and limited privacy became the more respectable path. And still, the contradiction remained. The same world that treated bathing as risky or immodest also expected women to look and smell immaculate. Not merely passably clean, but almost spiritually fragrant. Writers described ideal women as smelling like lilies, honey, or spring rain. Never sweat, never kitchen smoke, never food, certainly never reality. And this burden was not evenly shared. Noble women were held to nearly impossible expectations. You might sit for hours in layered garments, in crowded halls, beside fireplaces or among bodies, and somehow still be expected to radiate freshness. One wrong whiff, and gossip began. She smells tired. She smells traveled. She smells too real. A figure sometimes mentioned in literary tradition is Isolde of Brittany, who is praised not only for pale skin and beautiful hair, but for smelling like flowers even after travel. Whether that was meant literally or poetically is impossible to prove, but the idea stuck. The perfect woman was not just visually pleasing. She smelled like an ideal season. Historians still debate how literally we should take all of this. Some argue that beauty manuals exaggerate and that most people were more practical than the surviving texts suggest. Others point to letters, poems, and courtly records that clearly obsess over scent. In a world where proper bathing was inconsistent, smelling even slightly better than average could genuinely become a social advantage. There's even a strange fringe theory that the supposed sweet smell of saints' relics, the so-called odor of sanctity, fed into these expectations. If holy dead women were believed to smell like roses, what hope did a living noblewoman sweating inside velvet have, unless she drenched herself in fragrance? So once again, it is morning. You stand near the hearth while a servant rubs lavender oil onto your wrists. Another drags a comb through hair that hasn't seen a real wash in some time, carefully removing anything that moved in overnight. You dab rose water at your neck. A sachet of mint disappears into your bodice. You inhale. You do not exactly feel clean, but you smell acceptable, maybe even lovely. Later, a knight pauses near you in court and murmurs that you smell like the first day of spring. You offer the faintest smile. Beneath the perfume, your scalp still itches. Under the gown, your body is warm and tired, and you have not had a true bath in weeks. But no one needs to know. Of course, scent was only one battle. Because if perfume failed and your skin began showing signs of stress, there was always the cosmetics chest waiting in the corner, full of creams and powders that were somehow even more dangerous than the smell they tried to cover. Now we enter the truly glamorous horror show of medieval makeup. Lead, mercury, arsenic, vinegar, all casually transformed into substances women applied directly to the face in pursuit of beauty. Let's begin with ceruse. It sounds elegant, almost luxurious, as if it might come in a little painted jar from some chic apothecary. In reality, ceruse was a heavy white cosmetic made from white lead and vinegar, aged until it turned into a smooth, pale paste. Women spread it over the face to achieve that perfect, bloodless finish. The look of someone whose circulation had politely withdrawn from the skin. Ceruse covered freckles, blemishes, unevenness, and the everyday strain of living in a violent world with no antibiotics and very little bodily autonomy. It made the wearer appear angelic. It also damaged the skin terribly. Used repeatedly, it could make the face blister, peel, and break down. There are accounts of noblewomen whose skin became so inflamed from daily use that servants had to apply the cream carefully around raw patches and open sores. And did they stop? Of course not. They applied more. The cosmetic created the damage, and then more cosmetic was required to hide the damage. A vicious cycle, centuries before people learned how to name it. Lead wasn't the only poison in rotation. Mercury-based mixtures were also popular, especially in treatments meant to remove spots, discoloration, or any sign that the sun had dared touch your face. These were often applied at night, sometimes under cloth wrappings or masks, so the ingredients could work. And by work, we mean induced tremors, nerve damage, hallucinations, and long-term illness, all in the name of fading a blemish. Naturally, these products were not equally available. Ceruse and mercury compounds were costly and mostly belonged to elite beauty culture. But imitation trickled downward. Merchant-class women and others with fewer resources copied the effect using safer-looking, though still unpleasant, substitutes. Chalk, flour pastes, alabaster powder mixed with egg white. None of it truly nourished the skin. Most of it clogged pores, dried the face, and shortened the distance between vanity and visible harm. What makes all of this particularly grim is how closely it was tied to morality. White, flawless skin did not simply look beautiful. It implied virtue. It hinted at wealth, purity, even divine favor. Scars, moles, tans, and marks could all be interpreted as signs of moral disorder. Outward appearance was treated as evidence of inward worth. A clean, pale face suggested a clean, pale soul. And when the poison began showing on the skin, as it inevitably did, there were further solutions waiting. Blistering? Try rose water and crushed pearl. Skin turning gray? Add rouge. Which brings us to another charming cosmetic ingredient, cinnabar, also known as mercury sulfide. Women used it for red tinting, especially in the cheeks. So one poison damaged the face, and another poison brightened it. The routine gradually became a kind of slow chemical warfare waged across the skin. Not every woman followed that path. In some remote or rural areas, beauty treatments were more homespun. Bread dough masks, honey, egg mixtures, even snail slime. Yes, snail mucus was believed to improve the skin. Ridiculous as that sounds, modern skincare would later circle back to the same idea, which is perhaps the funniest revenge history ever produced. Still, for most women chasing elite beauty, the routine was destructive. Morning began with vinegar and salt scrubs. Then came the lead-based whitening paste. Then rouge. Then powder. Then the long hope that it would all hold through prayers, meals, ceremonies, and gossip. By evening, the face felt dry, strained, cracked. Smiling could pull at the skin. Blinking could sting. And the cruelest part was what happened once the makeup came off. The real skin underneath often looked worse than before, duller, more inflamed, more obviously human, which meant you had little choice but to start again the next day. The powder didn't just conceal damage, it trained women to fear their own uncovered faces. Scholars still dispute whether these cosmetics functioned mainly as beauty tools or as subtle forms of social control. Some argue the cult of whiteness and perfection helped reinforce hierarchy, noble over poor, virtuous over fallen, the polished over the laboring. Others suggest women used cosmetics as one of the few available ways to shape themselves, to control their appearance in a world that controlled almost everything else. Maybe both are true. Painting the face could be a trap. It could also be an act of self-construction. You built a myth, even if the myth was slowly unmaking you. And then, of course, there were men. Noblemen rarely wore face paint in the same way, unless they were performers or inhabiting very particular courtly settings. But they were often the ones deciding, praising, and policing what women were supposed to look like. Artists painted impossibly smooth ladies. Poets adored ivory skin and berry lips. Clerics condemned vanity, while simultaneously upholding standards that demanded visual perfection. Hypocrisy was woven into the culture as neatly as embroidery. So now you open your little wooden cosmetics box. Inside are your powders, your pigments, your chalk, your oils. You look in the mirror. The face looking back is blotchy, tired, angry at being treated this way. So you dab, blend, smooth, cover. You create the illusion of health, virtue, and perfection. Later, someone in the hall remarks that your skin resembles ivory. You smile and say nothing about what it cost. You do not mention the soreness in your cheeks or the knowledge that by 35, your body may already be paying for this beauty in ways no one yet understands. But tonight, in candlelight, you glow. And what people see is not the damage beneath. They see pale skin, carefully veiled hair, a modest mouth, an elegantly composed woman. The mask is working. That was never the end of it, though, because beyond powder and perfume lay another, even stranger ideal: the beauty of looking unwell, the sickly look. For a period, appearing fragile, faint, and almost consumptive was not just fashionable, it was admired as something nearly spiritual. Women were praised for translucent skin, deep shadows beneath the eyes, hollow cheeks, even a slight bluish cast to the lips. Radiance was less important than vulnerability. You were meant to seem delicate enough that the world itself might be too much for you. This had deep roots in medieval Christian thought. Suffering was not merely endured, it could be sanctified. Saints were beautiful in affliction. Women who carried pain quietly were seen as elevated. So if you looked as though you might swoon at any moment, it was not always cause for concern. Sometimes it was read as refinement. The fashionable body reflected that same preference. Thin wrists, fine ankles, pale hands, a long neck, a posture suggesting that reclining dramatically was your natural state. If a slight cough happened to lend your cheeks a faint flush, so much the better. Illness blurred into allure. Clothing assisted in this illusion. Long sleeves and fitted bodices made the frame appear narrower. Gowns were cut to elongate the body and emphasize vertical softness. If the head looked just a little too large for the body, that almost improved the effect. Strength was not attractive. Ornamentation was. And some women helped the illusion along. White powders made the skin look even thinner and flatter. Certain tints were used beneath the eyes to deepen shadows. Yes, some women deliberately enhanced the appearance of tiredness. The more tragic and frail you seemed, the more poetic the effect. There are even accounts of beauty tricks designed to mimic the softness of exhaustion. Cold metal pressed under the eyes, swelling encouraged just enough to suggest tears, sorrow, or lack of sleep. The desired message was not, "I am thriving." It was, "I have suffered beautifully." By this point, you are thin enough to seem holy, pale enough to look almost embalmed, and perfumed enough to distract from whatever reality remains underneath. It is absurd. It is theatrical. It is entirely in line with the culture. But before assuming these impossible expectations belonged only to women, it's worth glancing across the hall, because the young men of the medieval courts were not exactly free of pressure either. No, they were not coating their faces with lead or cooking their hair in urine. But medieval masculinity came with its own painful script, one that demanded bravery, elegance, wealth, piety, and physical control all at once. The ideal young man was tall, but not awkwardly so. Lean, but still visibly strong. His face should be sharp and clean, preferably with a high forehead, a straight nose, clear skin, and carefully groomed hair. His hands should suggest breeding and swordsmanship at once, refined, but not useless. He was expected to look like someone who could write a love poem by candlelight and still kill an enemy at dawn. And grooming mattered. Upper-class young men shaped their brows, removed stray facial hair, and used cleansing tonics, often vinegar-based, to keep the skin clear, because blemishes could be interpreted as signs of weak discipline or excessive lust. Appearance was tied to character for them, too. Beyond the face, the whole male body was trained for display. Boys of noble birth were raised for war, sport, and the demanding art of carrying themselves impressively. They had to look competent in armor, graceful in dance, dignified on horseback, and fluent in courtly performance. Medieval masculinity was not just strength. It was stylized strength. Fashion made that very clear. Men's clothing in the later Middle Ages could be just as revealing, restrictive, and performative as women's. Tight hose displayed the legs in exacting detail. Doublets were fitted. Colors mattered. Codpieces in some courts became so exaggerated that authorities had to regulate them. Men, too, could spend significant time arranging hair, selecting garments, and crafting an image. A historical example often invoked is Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. He embodied many ideals of aristocratic masculinity: military success, wealth, prestige, elegance, and tragic aura. Early depictions show him with the kind of face and bearing medieval culture admired. Later illness gave him the added pathos of noble decline, which only deepened his legend. Even in men, suffering could become part of attractiveness. And again, the pressure wasn't only aesthetic. It was moral and performative. A man had to be brave but not uncontrolled, devout but not dull, courteous but ready to fight. Too soft and he risked being mocked as unmanly. Too ornate in dress and he could invite suspicion. The ideal was narrow and unforgiving. Some historians even argue that courtly love poetry didn't only discipline women, it also disciplined men. It taught them how to act as lovers, noble, suffering, restrained, eloquent, perpetually yearning. Real men were encouraged to imitate fictional men, and fiction is rarely merciful. There are even odd little details, like beauty patches. Tiny decorative spots, sometimes worn on the face to cover blemishes or create an impression. Yes, even that. Somewhere in some court, a man in expensive hose was likely positioning a silk patch and hoping it held through the evening. Of course, peasant men had no time for this sort of self-fashioning. They were too busy surviving. But in elite settings, looks mattered enormously. A young man's prospects could rise or fall on bearing, grooming, clothes, and visible refinement. Beauty, once again, implied worth. So imagine yourself now not as the noble lady, but as a young lord. You have bathed, shaved, plucked, oiled your hair, laced yourself into fitted hose so tight your walk has become a controlled performance. Your collar is stiff. Your sleeves are arranged just so. Your sword is half weapon, half prop. You enter the great hall, where everyone is evaluating everyone else. Someone claps you on the shoulder and says you look like a painting come to life. You smile slightly, say something polished about the moon, then move on, making absolutely sure your cloak falls behind you at the correct angle. Because in this world, appearance is never just appearance. It is rank, virtue, control, and a role you are expected to perform whether you want it or not. Naturally, none of these clothes were breathable. So beneath all that elegance, people were sweating constantly. If you were dressed for court, you couldn't simply loosen a gown in public or step out of a layer because you felt faint. You stayed inside the structure of it all and quietly marinated in your own discomfort. Your waist ached. Your back stiffened. You lifted a fan and pretended not to be suffering, because suffering was built into the look. Beauty was not supposed to feel easy. It was supposed to feel transcendent. There were exceptions, of course. In private, noble women sometimes wore looser garments, especially during illness or pregnancy. But even then, the standard never really disappeared. If guests arrived unexpectedly, you were expected to compose yourself, tighten what needed tightening, cover what needed covering, and present a body that still made sense to the rules around you. The body was not private. It was read constantly, like text. One especially telling detail is that some girls were introduced to lacing young, sometimes around 12 years old. It might begin gently, but the expectations tightened with age. The message was clear. Get used to discomfort early. Learn to inhabit the body as something managed, contained, corrected. Historians debate how extreme this was in the Middle Ages compared with later eras. Some say early bodices were less brutal than Renaissance or Victorian corsets. Others point to skeletal remains that suggest compressed ribs and long-term bodily stress, especially among elite women who wore structured garments for years. The truth likely varies from case to case, but pain was absolutely part of the package. And it is worth remembering that most women did not invent this pressure for themselves. It came from every direction: family, church, suitors, court culture, social expectation. Women did not wake up one day and spontaneously decide to compress their breathing for beauty. They were taught, directly or indirectly, that the tighter the silhouette, the more refined the woman. The smaller the waist, the more marriageable the body. The more contained the figure, the more angelic the impression. So here you are again in your chamber. Your maid stands behind you and pulls the laces of your kirtle tighter. You brace yourself against the bedpost. Exhale. She pulls again. You try not to flinch. When the waist is finally cinched, she smooths the fabric and helps you into the outer gown. It feels like armor, gorgeous, heavy, exhausting. Later, you glide through the hall with your spine held straight and your hands composed. You cannot breathe deeply. You cannot turn quickly. But from a distance, you look exquisite. Someone whispers that you move as though you float. You know better. You are being held together by yards of linen and other people's expectations. And yet clothing was only one side of the performance. The face still had to speak the right language. Or rather, not speak too much. Because in medieval beauty culture, lips carried their own set of meanings. Those two small lines of flesh on your face were not neutral. They could suggest class, character, morality, restraint, desire. Sometimes all at once. If they were too red, too full, too expressive, they might imply appetite. If they were too bare or too severe, they could make you appear cold. The mouth had to hover in a narrow and exhausting sweet spot, soft, closed, suggestive of refinement, but never openly sensual. It's easy to assume that rosy lips would have been prized, but medieval beauty favored something far more ethereal. Bright red lips were often considered too lively, too earthy, too lustful. A faint pink might pass. Anything bolder could attract suspicion. Religious authorities were particularly wary of women tinting the mouth because cosmetics were often framed as deception, a way of falsifying nature and tempting men through artifice. And the lips, being close to both speech and kissing, attracted special scrutiny. That said, women absolutely did color them. They used crushed berries, beet juice, alkanet root, and even residue from red wine. But applying color to the lips was risky. Depending on the place and the company, it could mark a woman as vain, manipulative, or morally suspect. Religious writers sometimes claim that a painted mouth hid a woman's true nature and transformed beauty into a trap. There's even a piece of folklore about a painted woman whose lips were so red they seemed to bleed lies. That, more or less, was the cultural mood. Better a pale, unreadable mouth than one that looked too eager, too alive, too aware of itself. And yet, in more fashionable courts, Burgundy, Venice, and other centers of elegance, subtle lip color became a quiet weapon. A carefully applied berry stain could communicate sophistication, sensuality, and control without tipping into vulgarity. The key was subtlety. You weren't supposed to look painted. You were supposed to look naturally blessed by flattering light. Some households even treated lip color like code. A darker stain used lightly might be reserved for evening, when candlelight softened everything. In that setting, the lips could appear warm and flushed without looking overtly cosmetic. Some beauty guides suggested layering color in thin coats. Apply, blot, repeat. Medieval women understood buildable coverage long before modern tutorials pretended to invent it. Lip size mattered too. Small, pursed lips were prized because they suggested chastity, restraint, and self-possession. Fuller lips were much more dangerous territory. They hinted at appetite, sensuality, and too much visible feeling. A woman with prominent lips could become the target of gossip, mockery, or moral suspicion, regardless of what she had actually done. There are even stories of portraits being manipulated for exactly this reason. One account mentions a noblewoman in France whose marriage negotiations were allegedly harmed when a rival court circulated a portrait emphasizing the fullness of her lips. The implication was clear. Too sensual, too proud, too risky. She was eventually sent to a convent. Her mouth, apparently, said more than her voice was ever allowed to. And then there was smiling. As mentioned before, too much smiling was frowned upon. The ideal mouth stayed mostly closed. The corners might lift slightly, but not enough to reveal too much delight. A visible grin could look unrestrained. Open laughter could look scandalous. Showing teeth made a woman seem less controlled, and therefore less mysterious. And mystery in medieval femininity had value. Women in elite circles also used balms and scented preparations on the lips. Rose wax, honey, clove oil. These kept the mouth soft and pleasant, sometimes faintly aromatic, but without appearing overly painted. Again, balance was everything. You could be appealing, but you could not look as though you had set out to be appealing. You could smell sweet, but must seem innocent. Heaven forbid the effort became visible. Some historians even suspect that lip care sometimes functioned as a kind of flirtation ritual. A woman might dab balm onto her lips in sight of a particular man, fingers lingering just long enough to invite interpretation. The lips became both veil and signal, silence and message. So now you sit at your vanity once again. You dip your finger into a small pot of pomegranate balm and pat the color lightly onto your mouth. Not too much, just enough to catch the light. You blot with linen, check your reflection, and settle the lips into the perfect line. Not a pout, not a grin, not a smirk. Later at the banquet, someone glances toward you. His eyes linger briefly at your mouth. You pretend not to notice and say nothing at all. Of course, shaping the face was never enough. Medieval women were also reshaping the body itself through clothing long before the fully developed corset appeared. The classic corset belongs more properly to later centuries, but its medieval ancestors were already making life difficult. Noble women wore fitted undergarments, kirtles, cottes, tightly laced bodices that helped create an elongated torso and a narrower waist. These were not garments you simply slipped on. They required assistance, time, and a willingness to give up ease of movement. The goal was consistent: a long, slim torso, modestly rounded hips, a gently narrowed middle, and shoulders that sloped with controlled grace. Not too curvy, not too sturdy, not too athletic. Just enough of a figure to suggest femininity, but never enough to imply physical vigor. Getting dressed into these garments was far from graceful. It meant twisting, tightening, holding one's breath, and enduring cords that dug into the ribs. Linen shifts were worn underneath to reduce friction, but they did not eliminate discomfort. There was no stretch fabric, no softness, no mercy. Household records from elite homes suggest that dressing the body correctly could take a significant amount of time. A duchess or a lady of rank might spend an hour simply being fitted, adjusted, and readjusted, depending on the day's events. If she expected a public appearance, the bodice might be pulled tighter. If she was seated for long stretches, perhaps a slight compromise was allowed. Clothing wasn't just apparel, it was social engineering, and in some cases, the stiffening grew more literal. Reed, whalebone, and even metal strips began appearing in certain structured garments by the late medieval period. Not yet the full corset, but clearly moving in that direction. By the late 15th century, some bodices were rigid enough that bending at the waist became difficult. You no longer sat casually, you reclined. If you dropped something, someone else picked it up. As always, slowness itself became part of the beauty ideal. Over these fitted layers came outer gowns, sometimes more than one, often heavy with velvet, embroidery, fur, or jewels. These garments could weigh a great deal. They were not designed for freedom of movement. They were designed to make a woman look stately, controlled, and expensive. Quit movement belonged to laborers. Grace belonged to those who could afford to move slowly. So here you are once more, laced in, perfumed, pale as carved bone. And still the body is not finished, because modesty had to be fastened onto the head as well. This is where the wimple enters. That chin-hugging, neck-covering, distinctly medieval arrangement of cloth was more than an accessory. It was a visible statement of discipline, modesty, and social conformity. The wimple wrapped beneath the chin, around the neck, and often under a coif or veil. Married women especially were expected to wear it in public. In some towns, unmarried women of a certain age had to wear them too. Apparently, an exposed neck was enough to unsettle civilization. The principle behind the wimple was simple. Modesty had to be visible. It was not enough to behave modestly or think modestly. The modest body needed to look modest from every angle. Hair, ears, neck, jawline, all of it had to disappear into linen. Young noble women might sometimes loosen the arrangement slightly, allowing the faintest suggestion of hairline or contour if they felt brave enough to flirt with danger. But even that small act could invite criticism, gossip, or sermons about Eve and the dangers of female display. Priests regularly warned women that careless exposure led men into sin. So if you forgot your pins, apparently humanity itself was at risk. The visual roots of the wimple are obvious. It echoed the way the Virgin Mary and female saints were depicted in religious imagery. Faces framed by soft, controlled cloth, necks fully covered, hair hidden. Women were expected to imitate that holy silhouette in everyday life. The result was pious, yes, but also hot, itchy, and impractical. Linen trapped heat in summer, stiffened in winter, and behaved terribly in the wind. Running in one was a spectacularly bad idea. Eleanor of Provence, Queen Consort of England, became associated with especially elaborate head coverings. Some so starched and sculptural they were nearly architectural. Even then, of course, clergy complained that certain versions were too ornate for truly godly women. Which just proves the point. No matter how obedient the garment, someone was always ready to say, "You wore it wrong." Historians debate how much individuality women could express within these coverings. Some see the wimple as simply another instrument of female silencing. Cover your neck, cover your mouth, contain yourself. Others argue that women used folds, fabrics, lace trims, and drape styles to signal status, mood, or even subtle flirtation. A looser arrangement might hint at softness or grief. A more tightly wrapped one could project austerity, mourning, or control. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Constraint was real, so was quiet adaptation. So now you sit before your polished bronze mirror while your maid brings over a freshly pressed wimple, warm from the heat. She pins it at your temples, tucks the cloth beneath your chin, smooths the folds over your shoulders. The linen presses gently against your jaw. Secure, restrained, like a reminder shaped into fabric. Later, you move through the hall, speaking softly, never lifting your eyes too high. A man you do not know remarks that you have the face of a saint. You smile politely, but you know that is not quite true. You have the face of a woman. And in this world, that fact must be hidden under cloth, performance, and endless interpretation. And yet, no matter how restrictive or sanctimonious these garments were, the images surrounding women shaped medieval self-perception just as much as the clothes themselves. Beauty did not live only in the body. It lived in paintings, tapestries, manuscripts, and the visual imagination of the age. In other words, beauty was constantly being curated, edited, and projected. So now we move into the world of medieval image making, the art of ideal beauty, or rather, the art of filtering reality until it resembled desire. Medieval art was never aiming for realism in the way modern viewers often expect. It wasn't documentary. It was symbolic, moralizing, aspirational. Noble women painted in manuscripts and panel portraits were given impossibly long necks, tiny waists, delicate hands, calm expressions, and nearly interchangeable faces. Smooth skin, pale complexion, composed posture, all of it repeated again and again. These images were less like portraits and more like visual wish lists. A woman depicted in such art was not merely a person. She was a sign of status, virtue, and cultural approval. Tapestries pushed the fantasy even further. Courtly ladies reclined beneath trees, played instruments, handled falcons, and drifted through gardens as though gravity had made a private exception for them. Their hair spilled in golden waves, their gowns floated in impossible folds, and their expressions hovered somewhere between holy detachment and carefully arranged allure. These weren't slices of everyday life. They were fantasies stitched in silk and thread. One of the most famous examples is the series now known as The Lady and the Unicorn. In each panel, the central woman appears almost unchanged. Same pale face, same quiet gaze, same composed little smile. Surrounded by flowers, jewelry, animals, and symbols, she becomes less a human being than an emblem. She is not meant to look real. She is meant to look ideal. And manuscript art carried the same message. In illuminated books, especially devotional texts, women seemed to glow. Saints, noble daughters, allegorical maidens, all rendered with elongated features, downcast eyes, and smooth, untroubled faces. Even when they were being tortured, persecuted, or martyred, they often looked calm and graceful. Because in medieval visual culture, suffering was acceptable, so long as it remained beautiful. The artists weren't being careless. They were following a template. The church, the nobility, and the artists themselves all depended on a shared visual language. This is what a good woman looks like. This is what purity looks like. This is what beauty looks like. And because beauty and virtue were constantly linked, the image became instructional. That mattered. A girl turning the pages of a book of hours was not only learning her prayers, she was learning what faces were worthy of admiration. A man gazing at a tapestry was not merely enjoying craftsmanship. He was absorbing a template for what women should resemble. Art was not passive decoration. It taught people how to see. Some families even commissioned portraits that deliberately improved their daughters. A longer neck here, lighter skin there, a smoother jaw, straighter posture, brighter eyes. This was not considered deceitful so much as sensible. One 15th century merchant's letter to a painter reportedly requested that the lady's eyes be brightened, her nose softened, and her posture improved. In modern terms, flatter her, but make it respectable. Men participated in this visual storytelling too. Portraits often included props to reinforce the woman's identity. A small dog for loyalty, a book for refinement, a lily for purity, a unicorn for chastity. Every object around her worked like an argument. You weren't just seeing a person. You were being told what to believe about her. And yet no real woman could fully live up to these images. No one had that much perfect hair. No one glowed in candlelight like polished pearl every hour of the day. No one sat that still and stayed that serene without physical strain. The art created expectations that life itself could not satisfy. Still, women tried. They lightened hair, tightened bodices, starved themselves, practiced softer expressions, and learned to hold the head at that ideal downward angle in case anyone important happened to look. Historians still debate whether these images did more harm than good. Some argue they reinforced rigid and damaging expectations, turning women into decorative moral symbols instead of people. Others suggest the images also offered aspiration and escape, a way to imagine oneself as admired, elevated, almost legendary. Both readings probably hold some truth. The fantasy was beautiful. It was also merciless. So now imagine walking through your family's gallery. Portraits of ancestors line the walls. Their eyes seem to follow you. Every face is pale, controlled, beautiful, and utterly composed. None of them look quite like you, but all of them tell you what you are expected to become. You stop before one painting, a great-grandmother perhaps, rendered serene and faultless. Her mouth has that small, unreadable smile artists loved. She looks perfect. She looks nothing like the stories people tell about her temper. You raise a hand to your own face. Your skin is warm. Your eyes are tired. You are undeniably alive. And somehow, in a world like this, that already feels like rebellion. But beauty standards did not stop at the face or the painted image. They went all the way down to the feet. Yes, even the medieval foot was made to carry cultural meaning. Hidden most of the time beneath fabric and leather, feet still became objects of fantasy, judgment, and symbolism. The ideal foot was supposed to be small, narrow, high-arched, and delicate. In other words, entirely unsuited to the actual roads of medieval Europe. That was part of the point. Beauty standards are never designed around reality. They are designed around class aspiration. A dainty foot suggested that the woman attached to it did not labor, did not haul, did not walk long distances through mud and filth. If your feet looked as though they belonged nowhere near real work, that made them desirable. And how were feet displayed if they were mostly hidden? Through shoes. Medieval footwear, especially among the elite, could be absurd. Pointed shoes called poulaines became fashionable in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially for men, but the broader aesthetic of narrow, refined footwear affected women too. Some shoes had dramatically extended pointed toes, stuffed with moss or wool to hold their shape. The longer the point, the greater the implied status. They were built for display, not movement. The most extravagant examples bordered on parody. Some surviving shoes curl upwards so dramatically they look almost comic. And city officials occasionally did try to regulate them, especially during festivals, because overly long shoes became public hazards. Imagine tripping into disgrace because your fashion statement extended half a foot beyond your actual foot. For women, the symbolism shifted slightly. Men's absurd shoes screamed wealth. Women's shoes whispered fragility. A noblewoman's footwear was often soft, narrow, and impractical, offering very little protection from mud or rough ground, which was, again, the point. If your slippers could not handle the road, that implied you had servants, carriages, or attendants to protect you from it. There is even an account from medieval Paris of a noblewoman who employed servants to lay cloth in front of her on rainy days, so her slippers would not touch mud. Ridiculous, yes, but that image captures the logic perfectly. Feminine beauty meant never appearing grounded in the actual world. Small feet had their own mythology. Courtly poetry praised them as petal-like, swan-like, and graceful beyond practicality. Girls were sometimes encouraged to wear snug shoes in the hope that the feet would stay smaller and narrower. It was not the same system as Chinese foot binding, but the impulse rhymed with it. Restrict growth for the sake of an aesthetic ideal. Of course, peasant women had no such luxury. They needed durable footwear, stronger soles, functional protection. But even they were not fully free from judgment. Cracked heels, worn feet, or visible roughness could invite embarrassment. Feet, like everything else on the female body, could become a sight of shame. And then there is the truly strange part. Medieval poetry occasionally lingered on feet in, frankly, obsessive detail. Certain courtly love poems describe the lady's instep, heel, or delicate steps with a reverence normally reserved for relics. One poem from 14th century Castile compares a woman's feet to holy treasures. Apparently, somewhere in the Middle Ages, a man in chainmail was writing sincerely about heels, as though they were miraculous. Bare feet carried another set of meanings. In religious art, a barefoot woman often symbolized humility, penance, or holiness. Mary Magdalene, for example, could appear barefoot to signify repentance and vulnerability. But the barefoot female foot could also read as exposed, sensual, or socially precarious. Like everything else, context decided whether it was sacred or scandalous. Even smell entered the picture here. Medieval shoes were not exactly known for ventilation. Odor was inevitable, so women tried to manage it with herbs and scents. Rosemary, lavender, lemon peel, tucked into shoes or rubbed into them to preserve some illusion of freshness. One 15th century beauty recommendation even suggests steeping the feet in wine and ash to cleanse away odor and, charmingly, sin. So again, there you are in your chamber. Your maid helps you into your soft slippers and ties them gently at the ankle. Your toes still ache from yesterday's feast. The shoes are elegant, but they press in all the wrong places. Later, seated by the fire at court, you cross your ankles neatly beneath your gown. A knight glances in your direction, just enough to notice the tip of your shoe. He smiles. You return the smile and wonder how much longer you can sit before your feet cramp. And then morning comes again. Before sunrise. Not because your life is peaceful, but because looking effortless in a noble household takes hours of effort. So now we step into the private world many men never saw, the daily beauty routine of a high-born medieval woman. It is not dreamy. It is labor. Cold labor. The day begins with a basin of cold water, because heating water costs time and work. You splash your face, brace yourself, and begin cleansing. A cloth soaked in vinegar or wine mixed with crushed herbs is rubbed over the skin. It smells sharp. It stings. It leaves the face somewhere between refreshed and irritated. But slight inflammation is preferable to visible blemishes. Impurity must be performed, even if the pores protest. Next comes whitening. You apply your ceruse or lead paste, smoothing it carefully with linen. It feels cool, thick, chalky. You try not to dwell on what it will eventually do to your skin. That is a future problem. Today, you need to survive court. If your cheeks look too drained, you touch them with a little color. Crushed cochineal, alkanet, beet pigment, perhaps mixed with fat or egg white. Just enough to imply life, not enough to suggest vulgarity. Your lips might get a faint balm, soft but restrained. Then comes the hair. If you follow social and religious norms, it has not been freshly washed. Instead, it has been combed, oiled, and wrapped. Now it must be arranged. If you are unmarried, perhaps a little may show. If you are married, it disappears. Your maid brushes it out, catches on a knot, murmurs an apology, and keeps going. The braids are wound tight around the head. Pins go in. Coif on. Veil next. Wimple depending on the day. Then dressing. First the linen shift. Then the kirtle, tightly laced. You hold onto a bedpost while your maid pulls. Your ribs compress. Your waist narrows. Your breath learns its boundaries. Then the outer gown. Velvet if your household can afford it. Fine wool if it cannot quite. You examine the cuffs, the stitching, the trim. Any fraying suggests neglect, and neglect can be moralized faster than almost anything. Jewelry is chosen with care. Shoes are tied. If you cannot reach them, someone else does it. And after all of that, the truly difficult part begins. Walking. You are expected to glide. Steps small, spine straight, shoulders quiet. No rushing, no bouncing, no visible effort. Your gown is heavy enough to trip you if you lean incorrectly. Your body is laced tightly enough to punish deep breathing. Still, you must move through it all as though you were born to float through fabric. Breakfast is light, if taken at all. Perhaps fruit, a little bread, diluted wine. Eating too much beneath a fitted gown is a practical inconvenience and, culturally, a moral risk. Appetite must stay in check. At table, if men discuss politics or trade, you are not expected to dominate. You are expected to look gently attentive. Then come the public hours: prayer, embroidery, visits, perhaps a walk in the garden if the shoes permit. You must not sweat too visibly. If it is hot, you use a fan. If it is cold, you endure it beautifully. Comfort is irrelevant. Grace is the assignment. By evening, the face itches beneath makeup. The scalp aches from braids and pins. The laces have left marks across the ribs. At last you return to your chamber, and the undoing begins. One layer removed, then another. Veil off, pins out, jewelry away. The maid loosens the bodice, and you finally inhale properly. In the mirror, without all the additions, you catch sight of your actual face. There are red patches along the jaw. The lips feel dry. The skin beneath the powder looks tired and slightly inflamed. Warm rose water is brought. Then an ointment meant to soothe the damage, though it can only do so much. The maid rubs it gently into the cheeks and bows herself out. And now, finally, you are alone. You lie down with clean skin that still tingles from the day's rituals. Tomorrow it will all begin again. The whitening, the binding, the arranging, the posture, the gaze, the performance. Beauty is not a blessing here. It is a regime. A full-time occupation without wages and without rest. And when sleep finally comes, what you dream of is not praise or jewels or candlelit admiration. You dream of walking barefoot through grass with your hair loose and no one watching. Morning again. A weak band of sunlight slips through the narrow glass window and catches the frayed edge of your linen veil. Another day begins, another slow surrender to powder, posture, and ritual silence. But today is not an ordinary day. Today is a feast day, which means beauty is no longer enough on its own. Today, you must look holy as well. And in the medieval imagination, there is only one model grand enough for that task: the Virgin Mary. Because in the tangled logic of the age, every woman is expected to resemble a saint and a virgin all at once, even if she is married, widowed, or already deep into motherhood. The Virgin Mary was not merely a religious figure. She was the template, the standard, the original setting to which feminine virtue was constantly reset. Pure, gentle, obedient, beautiful. But crucially, not beautiful in a way that felt overtly erotic. Her beauty was sacred, not sensual. And so women across medieval Europe were expected to imitate her, not only in conduct, but in appearance, posture, clothing, and expression. She was less a person than a lifelong role women were asked to perform. And she was everywhere. On church walls, in books, in altarpieces, in sermons, in songs, in painted glass. There was no escaping her. You could only attempt to resemble her, and inevitably fail. Because Mary was not an ordinary woman in these representations. She was not even fully human in the way the standard demanded. She was a symbol, a vessel for ideals no living woman could permanently sustain. In painting after painting, she appears the same way. Pale skin, serene face, straight nose, downcast eyes, soft mouth, hair either fully hidden or arranged in gentle, controlled waves. Her whole presence suggests calm purity. Even in scenes of birth or sorrow, she looks composed beyond reality, almost untouched by bodily strain. So how do you, a mortal woman in a cold stone chamber, attempt to echo that impossible image? First, through clothing. Marian blue becomes the ideal, if you can manage it. Deep celestial blue was associated with the Virgin, though truly rich blue fabric could be outrageously expensive. The pigments and dyes connected with it were luxuries. If you couldn't afford a rich blue gown, then softer pale shades or white might stand in for purity. The neckline stays high. Sleeves are long. The veil is adjusted carefully so that even the ears disappear. No loose strand is allowed to hint at vanity. No curve should seem emphasized. You are not supposed to stride. You are supposed to glide. There is an entire literary tradition built around this celestial feminine ideal. Religious poems and devotional songs describe Mary using language that sounds suspiciously close to courtly love verse. Only instead of stirring desire, the aim is reverence. Her cheeks are compared to lilies, her voice to fresh spring water, her body to flawless light. The vocabulary is devotional, but it is also visual. Girls absorb it not just as theology, but as instruction. And here the contradiction sharpens. Mary is both virgin and mother, which means real women are expected to marry, bear children, and fulfill domestic roles while still projecting a version of untouched innocence. They must seem nurturing, maternal, soft, but never too physical, never too sensual, never too visibly transformed by age, sex, or childbirth. It is an impossible synthesis. Virginity with motherhood, experience with innocence, presence with self-erasure. A good example of this public image-making is Isabella of Castile. She was known for deep religious devotion and carefully cultivated a Marian image. In portraits, she appears modestly dressed, tightly veiled, pale, calm, almost immovable in dignity, even after multiple pregnancies and years of political life. In reality, she was formidable, strategic, and often ruthless. But visually, she was rendered like an altar candle given human shape. And still, the ideal was not always consistent everywhere. In more cosmopolitan courts, Avignon, Milan, and other centers of display, Marian modesty sometimes blended with a more worldly sophistication. A woman could appear serene and saint-like in public while wearing private layers embroidered with courtly verses or tokens of romantic intrigue. Holiness became another veil, useful, beautiful, suffocating, and sometimes strategic. This is why historians remain divided on how medieval women related to the Virgin Mary as an ideal. Some scholars argue she offered comfort, a divine mother figure, a source of protection, an example of dignity. Others see her as a tool of repression, used to push women into narrow roles of obedience, silence, and unattainable purity. The truth was likely both. Some women found power in Marian devotion. Others were crushed under its weight. Many probably experienced both at once. And yet, even inside that pressure, rebellion flickered. Women learned that performing holiness was not always the same as surrendering. They could wear the veil like armor. They could lower their eyes in public and speak differently in private. They could light candles to Mary and still whisper their own truths in corridors and gardens. Looking holy could become a form of social camouflage. So now, back in your chamber, your maid wraps the veil and smooths it until it falls exactly as it does in the paintings. You tilt your head. Practice the expression, serene, kind, distant, composed. Hands folded neatly at the waist. At the feast, you speak softly. Keep your posture measured. Let your eyes remain lowered. A bishop praises your modesty. A courtier murmurs that you shine like Our Lady herself. You smile, just barely, and privately think that the Virgin Mary never had to sit under lead-based cosmetics for hours, or pretend not to know what wine tastes like. But now let the focus shift, because beauty in the medieval world did not always serve only piety, obedience, or male fantasy in the passive sense. Some women learned to use those standards back against the world that imposed them. They sharpened the veil, turned the script inside out, used beauty not merely as compliance, but as leverage. Now we enter the glittering, dangerous territory of the medieval seductress. Not the cartoon villain of sermons, but the woman who understood that if appearance was already political, it could also be weaponized. One of the best-known examples is Agnès Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France. She is often remembered as one of the earliest women in European court culture to turn beauty into overt influence. She was not born into the highest nobility, but she rose rapidly through courtly life by becoming impossible to ignore. She wore pearls, furs, and gowns with necklines bold enough to make clergy uneasy. She powdered her skin, staged her presence, and made sure people remembered her. And it worked. Agnès did not merely look beautiful. She played the court like an instrument. Through her access to the king, she gained influence for her family, supported allies, and secured a level of luxury so extravagant that chroniclers complained about it. Some even credited her with helping pull Charles out of one of his darker emotional periods during the 100 Years' War. While men fought and counseled, she shaped morale through presence, charm, and timing. Not all power through beauty was so close to the throne, though. In Venice, the cortigiane oneste, the so-called honest courtesans, complicated the whole picture. These were not simply women trading on appearance. Many were educated, highly articulate, socially skilled, and deeply aware of performance. They knew poetry, fashion, conversation, philosophy. They entered rooms knowing exactly how much silence to use, how much wit to reveal, how much allure to permit. Men did not only desire them, some envied the fluency with which they inhabited power. These women grasped something many noble women were never allowed to say out loud. If society insists on judging you by your appearance, then appearance itself can become a stage, and stages can be controlled. There are also more shadowy figures in the historical imagination. Women like the oft-mentioned Sibylla of Prague, who was said to have used her beauty, dress, and courtly mimicry to gain audiences with merchants, clergy, and minor nobles. Whether every detail of her story is true hardly matters. What matters is that such stories existed. They reveal a cultural fascination and fear surrounding women who understood how to manipulate visual codes. According to rumor, she layered imported fabrics carefully, perfumed her skin with rose oil, trained herself in noble speech patterns, and used charm as a way to broker access and influence. One official supposedly remarked that she spoke less than a lady, but moved more than a bishop. Whether real or embellished, that line captures the anxiety perfectly. Because that was the real issue. Women were permitted to possess beauty, but not to use it too knowingly. The moment beauty looked intentional, strategic, political, it became alarming. A woman who openly leveraged beauty for influence could quickly be labeled manipulative, unnatural, or demonic. Sermons condemned such women. Songs mocked them. Rumors surrounded them. Agnès Sorel herself was later rumored to have died by poison, perhaps through court rivalry. Many courtesans who thrived while young and admired ended their lives in diminished circumstances once beauty faded or patrons disappeared. That is the bitter truth behind all of this. Beauty could open doors, but usually only conditionally. You could play the game. You were rarely allowed to own the board. And still, some women used beauty less to seduce than to shield themselves. A reputation for grace could conceal intelligence. A quiet widow in elegant mourning could manage land, servants, and finances without seeming threatening. A soft voice and perfect posture could make others underestimate you just long enough for you to act. So historians continue to debate, were such women empowered, or merely clever captives adapting to the only currency offered to them? Some say they traded real freedom for temporary influence. Others argue they subverted the system from within, using the only available tools to carve out room for themselves. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the knot of contradiction is the truth. These women did not invent the rules. They inherited them like an old corset, beautiful, restrictive, and impossible to ignore. So they laced it tighter, posed in it, learned where it bent, and used it until it cut too deep. So now imagine the feast hall again. Perfume hangs in the air. Politics and gossip blend with candle smoke. Across the table sits a visiting duchess, telling a story with perfect rhythm and a smile that carries just enough danger to hold the room. The men lean in. She lifts her goblet with elegant precision, exposing only a little of the wrist. It is enough. Her timing is immaculate. Then your eyes meet. She gives the slightest nod. You return it. Not allies, exactly. Not enemies, either. Just two women navigating a game built from impossible rules. And later, back in your chamber, the fire has burned low. The feast is over. The gown is set aside. The paint has been scrubbed away. In the quiet that follows display, you finally have room to think. And the thought that presses in is simple. None of this was ever really about you. Every rule, every ritual, every beauty standard, each one feels like wearing a garment stitched from other people's fantasies. It never fits correctly. It pinches in strange places. It weighs more than it should. And yet you've spent your life learning how to move in it as though it were natural. From the time you were first told to lower your voice and lower your eyes, from the first moment a priest compared female worth to a flower that was only valuable before it wilted, you were taught to live inside a role. First the maiden, then the bride, then the mother, then, if you lasted long enough, the widow. Each stage came with its own costume, its own posture, its own approved form of silence. And every stage came with contradictions. Too pale, and you looked sickly. Too flushed, and you looked sinful. Too thin, and you seemed saintly. Too full-bodied, and people hinted at indulgence. The body was never allowed to simply be. It had to mean something. It had to be read. It had to be corrected. Your body belonged not to you, but to a system of interpretation built by priests, poets, painters, anxious husbands, and social fear. It was a canvas others kept repainting. You have watched other women vanish into those images. Saints, wives, temptresses, scandals, relics. Sometimes all at once. You have memorized the poses, knees together, voice softened, smile modest, appetite hidden. You have heard dying mothers pray that their daughters might be beautiful enough to survive marriage. And in a way, survival really did depend on it. Because this was never just about attraction. It was about compliance. Beauty sweetened obedience. If you were beautiful, people were more likely to assume you were good. If you were good, they expected you to stay quiet. If you stayed quiet, the world flowed more comfortably around you, so long as you never crossed the lines drawn for you. Some modern scholars argue that beauty in the medieval world wasn't only linked to virtue, it sometimes replaced it. Women could not vote, rule openly, inherit equally, or move freely through many structures of power. So appearance became one of the few forms of currency available. If you could not command, perhaps you could enchant. If you could not speak loudly, perhaps you could glow. But even that reading is incomplete, because women were not merely passive surfaces for other people's desire. They used beauty in calculated ways. They stitched alliances through charm, softened hostility with grace, hid wit behind composure, and sometimes flirted with disaster simply to feel visible. Yet each small victory carried a cost. The moment a woman aged, spoke too boldly, dressed too richly on the wrong day, or simply became inconvenient, the admiration could vanish. One day luminous, the next forgotten. And in the end, no matter how intelligent or politically astute she had been, her story was often reduced to her face, her gown, her body, her beauty. You remember women like that. A lady whose diplomacy calmed men ready to go to war, only to hear someone later praise the line of her jaw instead of the brilliance of her strategy. A peasant girl too pretty to be safe, accused of tempting the wrong people. Another too plain to attract a husband, slowly pushed toward the margins, where plainness became strangeness, and strangeness became suspicion. Beauty could be an advantage. Beauty could also be a wound, or both at once. And now, here you still are, still looking into the mirror, not because of vanity, but because reflection has become part of survival. You search for lines, for changes, for any sign that you are still legible within the rules of the game. You wonder how many other women in rooms like this have done the same. Candles low, hair unbound, face bare, asking themselves who they are beneath all the signals and disguises. And then, perhaps for the first time, another possibility begins to form. What if you stopped? What if one morning you dressed without symbolism? What if you ate without fear? What if you laughed too loudly, spoke too directly, walked barefoot without apology? What if you were seen not as an emblem, not as a saint, not as a carefully edited body, but as a self? You close your eyes and imagine a world in which beauty does not determine moral worth. A world in which value does not collapse when youth fades. A world in which a woman is not an allegory to be interpreted, but a person to be known. And that thought, instead of frightening you, begins to feel like relief. Because maybe, even here, even under all these layers of lace, silence, piety, and performance, something inside you still remembers that being unpainted, unposed, and unmistakably yourself may be the most dangerous and beautiful thing of all. It's nearly midnight now. Your chamber has gone quiet, almost unnervingly quiet. The fire has fallen to embers, and the last candles give off only the softest wash of warmth. You lie back with your head resting on a goose-feather pillow, and at last the full weight of it all begins to settle. The gown, the rituals, the scrutiny, the lifelong pressure of existing beneath standards you never chose, all of it seems to seep down into your bones. But before sleep fully takes you, there is one last truth waiting in the dark. Because medieval beauty standards did not disappear with the Middle Ages. They did not vanish when the wimples came off. They did not die with lead makeup or stiffened bodices. They changed costumes, that is all. They slipped into modern mirrors, into advertisements, into edited photographs and filtered faces. They stopped calling themselves piety and started calling themselves wellness, glow, self-care, elegance, confidence, clean beauty. But underneath the new language, the old logic still lingers. We inherited the same impossible demand. Be beautiful, but don't look vain. Be attractive, but modest. Be youthful for as long as possible, but never let anyone see the work. Look effortless, even if effort consumes you. You can wash off the paint now. You can step out of the gown. You can laugh with your teeth showing. You can ignore the sermon. You can keep the lines on your face. You can keep your softness, or change it for yourself. You can decide that your reflection belongs to you, and not to some old echo whispering that virtue must be visible in bone structure and skin tone. Because here is the deeper truth. None of those standards ever loved you back. You've met every version of the ideal, the saint, the maiden, the soft-spoken beauty, the pale apparition, the flawless ornament. And not one of them offered you freedom. They only asked for more silence, more restraint, more self-erasure, more labor in the service of looking effortless. And still, even now, people continue to act as though the body reveals the soul. Good skin must mean discipline. Straight teeth must mean self-respect. A slim waist must mean virtue. A polished appearance must mean competence, worth, desirability, goodness. It is the same lie wearing different fabric. Scroll through social media, and the old medieval logic is everywhere. Makeup tutorials designed to look as if you aren't wearing makeup. Edited portraits presented as authenticity. Products sold not just as cosmetics, but as proof of purity. Clean ingredients, pure formulas, natural glow. The vocabulary has changed, but the message is familiar. The aim is still to look better without appearing to have tried too hard. And aging? That part barely changed at all. Now wrinkles are called fine lines, softening the cruelty but not removing it. The expectation remains: blur them, erase them, smooth them, freeze them, filter them. Stay youthful but naturally. Don't age, but don't seem concerned about aging either. Don't fight time too visibly. Don't surrender to it too openly. It is still the same old demand to appear untouched by time itself. Want to wear makeup? Make it invisible. Want to be sexy? Make it seem accidental. Want to be noticed? Be careful not to threaten anyone. Be complimented, but not envied. Be desirable, but only in ways that don't discomfort the people doing the desiring. In other words, the game remains unwinnable. Because somewhere beneath the polished surface of modern life, society still prefers a woman who disappears into beauty, who glows without visible labor, ages without visible struggle, speaks without taking up too much space, and somehow manages to be both fully present and conveniently non-threatening. And if that has ever left you feeling exhausted, that exhaustion is not a personal failure. You were born into a system that has been refining this performance for centuries. That voice in your head, the one that tells you to fix, smooth, reduce, soften, conceal, that voice has a history. It is not random. It is ancient. It is every priest, poet, painter, advertiser, and algorithm that ever tried to convince women their worth should be visible before it is spoken. The glossy ad promising radiant skin and inner confidence, that is a sermon in modern packaging. The filtered face presented as everyday reality, that is a tapestry. The claim that beauty should look natural, that effort should remain hidden, that youth should somehow remain untouched, that is medieval logic with better lighting. And there is a reason those ideals persist. They sell things. They keep people busy. They keep people uncertain. They keep people focused on the body, instead of asking harder questions about value, power, and choice. They turn self-doubt into commerce. They encourage constant self-correction. They make you spend time, money, energy, and emotion chasing a moving target that was never meant to be caught. Because here is the secret nobody benefiting from the system wants to say too clearly. Beauty is not truth. Beauty is theater. And for a very long time, women have been made to perform leading roles in someone else's script. But here's the part worth holding on to. You are still here. You, reading this now, with your own face, your own body, your own life, have outlived every medieval lie about what a woman is supposed to be. You have survived the inheritance of the plucked hairline, the saintly silence, the corseted ribs, the sickly glow, the powdered obedience. You are living proof that none of those myths ever truly owned you. And maybe that is the quiet revolution. Not perfection, not purity, not vanishing gracefully into someone else's fantasy, but remaining human, remaining visible, remaining imperfect, loud, tired, aging, real. Remaining yourself even after centuries of pressure tried to shape you into something easier to admire than to know. So go ahead, turn out the candle. Let the beauty standards fall asleep without you tonight. You have already carried enough of them. You do not owe them your face. You do not owe them your youth. You do not owe them your silence. And in the hush of this final hour, your hair loose, your skin bare, no one watching, no one measuring, no one comparing. Perhaps you can feel something deeper than approval. Not saintliness, not seduction, not perfection, just personhood. A body that has carried you this far. A heartbeat still choosing to remain. A self that exists underneath every costume history ever tried to force upon it. You close your eyes. The room is dim. The embers fade. And for the first time in a very long while, rest does not feel like surrender. It feels like refusal, like release, like stepping outside the frame. So sleep now, not as a saint, not as a symbol, not as a relic of other people's ideals, but as someone real. And that, more than pale skin, smaller teeth, tighter laces, holier silence, or flawless youth, may be the most impossible, dangerous, and beautiful thing of all.